So we're in your American United States history book. We're in chapter 8, section 4, the last section of chapter 8, the administration of John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist. Remember, George Washington was a Federalist. John Adams was a Federalist. And as we go on, we know Alexander Hamilton, was a Federalist. But when we get to Thomas Jefferson, he disagreed with the Federalists and it became his own party, which they called the Democrat Republic Party, or the Republicans, which were not the Republicans we see today. They were basically different. Jefferson's politics were different than the politics of today. But anyway, John Adams, some trivia about him. His height was only 5'7", just a little bit taller than me, right? His color was unusually high. His face was often reddish and his blue eyes blazed. These are some older pictures of him, which when he was younger, he looked quite different. He was the first presidential family to live in the finished White House. So when the White House was finished in Washington, D.C., he was the first president to move there. Actually, George Washington never lived in the White House. He lived basically in New York and Philadelphia before it was moved to the White House, where John Adams is. And so going on, he was the longest living president. He died at the age of 90 years old. There's really a little tidbit that we all need to know, is that he died on the 4th of July, celebrating, the Declaration of Independence, right? 50-year anniversary. And another president, we're going to find, Thomas Jefferson, died the same day. Although John Adams and Thomas Jefferson never agreed on their politics, they were friends, and they died the same day, although John Adams was older than Thomas Jefferson. It's kind of weird. Two presidents die at the same day on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Anyway, so we're going to go over the election of 1796, where Adams becomes president, onto the continual federal problems they're having, then this weird thing called the XYZ affair. XYZ is that they never labeled who they were, and this had to do with France again. XYZ affair. And then the concern at home, and then these Alien and Sedition Acts, which were kind of acts that were put out by the Federalists, especially, John Adams, that they feared the French Revolution would come here and that there would be aliens coming here, coming across our borders and taking us over. So, which was kind of paranoid at the time, I think. But anyway, and then on to Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, where they were standing up against laws that were unconstitutional, and we'll go over that. And then the victory for Thomas Jefferson for the next election. Now let's start with the election of 1796. This is the election. George Washington has been president, so this is for the second president of the United States. So the federal support went with John Adams, and Thomas Pinckney was running for the vice president. And the Republicans supported Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. We're going to talk about Aaron Burr. As you remember, Aaron Burr ended up not to be there's a whole conspiracy not to be a good guy. But as we know, Aaron Burr, 1756 to 1836, he was the killer of Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Although nobody knew and really witnessed the duel, but Alexander Hamilton was killed by Aaron Burr. Because Alexander Hamilton didn't support Aaron Burr and basically did not believe, later. Well, we'll go on. It actually happens after this point. Aaron Burr at this time had nothing against him. In fact, Alexander Hamilton was still alive. But John Adams won the election. At this time, he was the Federalist, won the election, and Congress did not distinguish between electoral votes for vice president. So basically everyone would vote, and the one with the most votes would become president, and the one with the next votes would become vice president. We find out that doesn't work at all, right? Because sometimes they're of total different parties, which happened at this election. So because they didn't distinguish between vice presidents, Adams won the most votes for president, and Jefferson won the second most votes, and they were two different parties and did not agree with each other, but Jefferson became the vice president under him. So it's the only time in history we have a president and a vice president that are two different parties. So here we have Adams and Jefferson. So here's the election results here, and you can see here the Federalists are usually in the north here, and we see all of this area where the Democrat republics followed by Jefferson, right? So, and this is the Northwest Territory over here. So this is Adams won this time. The continued foreign problems go on with Adams. Foreign problems don't just stop, huh? So Great Britain and France were at war, and the United States was caught in the middle of this war, and they were at odds with France after the Jay Treaty. Remember, the Jay Treaty went and made a treaty with Great Britain, which was not a good treaty really, because it really didn't do much, and Great Britain didn't really abide by the treaty. So, but anyway, they were odds with France and Great Britain. And French warships now were attacking American ships. Remember the English ships, the British ships were actually impressing sailors, or taking our sailors to fight in their war. And then on to the French ships now were attacking American ships. So it was very hard for America to stay neutral. So John Adams, the president, sent Charles C. Pinckney, his brother of Thomas. Thomas Pinckney, remember he made the treaty with Spain. Now we have his brother Charles. Charles is going to be famous because he runs for president multiple times but does not make it. But Adams sent Charles Pinckney, a Federalist, to France, but the French refused to even see him or listen to him. This is Charles Pinckney here. So France was in a turmoil, and who was in charge? At that time, nobody knows. We'll find out who gets in charge. Can you guess who comes in charge with France? Remember French history? Remember world history? Who becomes the dictator of France? Napoleon, right? Well, this is right before Napoleon. The XYZ affair. So, some called for war with France. The Federalists okay, France is attacking our ships. And so John Adams sent 3 men on a commission to France. Charles C. Pinckney, remember the guy that would later on run for president too. John Marshall, which later on would be the judge, the attorney general judge, and on to Elbridge Gerry. And they all 3 went over there to make a deal with France, or somehow have peace with France, because France were attacking our ships. So the French government at that time fell into the hands of this diabolic group of people called the Directory. So they went to the Directory of France, and France then sent 3 unofficial representatives to meet them, to meet our 3 guys, right? To talk to them. So the French had outrageous demands, and they really wanted to give them a payment of a large bribe. So the Directory sent them to bribe America, to give us some money to bribe us to do what they wanted us to do, right? A bribe. So the Peace Commission here, these 3 guys here, refused the bribe. We're not going to be bribed. When John Marshall returned, he went right straight to the president and said, well, you don't want to go over there and deal with these guys, XYZ, because these 3 guys came and they're insulted and bribed us. They were bribing us with money so that we would support their French Revolution, right? And so now, of course, the whole nation is going to know about the XYZ affair. How dare France bribe us, right? The Americans were outraged by the XYZ affair. The Americans heard of these bribes, and of course, they now were not going to support France, that's for sure. They were outraged and they demanded war. What are they doing in France? They are trying to bribe us, and then of course they're attacking us. And so they basically saying millions of dollars for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. So they were demanding, basically saying, not 1 cent for tribute for France. In 1798, they created the Department of Navy to build sea power. So remember, our sea power, our Navy, we didn't even have one back then. The war was not official, but many battles in the high seas did occur with France between the Americans and the French ships. So this is the XYZ affair. So this is not, President John Adams has to deal with all of this, these foreign things going on. Reaching a peaceful settlement. France did not want to get involved in this war with America, with American people. So they decided to receive this American envoy that came. And Adams realized the nation was not ready for war either, because we were at the brink of war with France now and on the brink of war with England. So he sent a new peace commission to France in 1799. That's the year that George Washington died. And now there was this other despot, this other dictator had overthrown the Directory. Remember, the Directory was running France, and he overthrew this guy right here, Napoleon Bonaparte. He overthrew the Directory in France, and now he was the head of the French government. Napoleon Bonaparte, he proved easier to deal with for the Americans than before. They were dealing with this Directory, it was crazy, chaotic, and now Bonaparte seemed to be more peaceful. In 1800, the year 1800, France and America did reach agreement with Napoleon. And they canceled the treaties of 1778 and regulations of trade. So here they had all these things. They're trying to deal with Napoleon Bonaparte, which you can imagine, because we'll find out in the end, he's very deceitful towards America. But we'll find something else later on, that he'll sell us our greatest piece of real estate, right? The Louisiana Purchase. Concern at home. Many Europeans were fleeing to the United States to escape from the French Revolution. It was crazy there. And of course, people from France were wanting to come, if they knew anybody in the United States, were wanting to come to America. Well, the Americans, a lot of them feared, like today, they feared this influx of foreigners would spread these revolutionary ideas in France, and they'd be coming here and setting up a guillotine in America or something, right? So President John Adams put forth in 1798 the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien and Sedition Acts turned out to be very detrimental. Because you would wonder, when do you turn it off, right? So who do you prosecute? Every person that comes over or what? So these were very hard. So this would stir up deep resentments between the foreign-born and native-born citizens. Like if you were born in France, you would be ostracized and persecuted at that time, thinking you might be one of these crazy, fanatical foreigners coming in with revolutionary ideas, right? So John Adams putting forth, the Federalists were more basically setting out to put forth these acts than, of course, Thomas Jefferson looked at them as silly acts. The Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. So what were they? First, the Nationalization Act. What was that? It increased the time the foreigners must reside in the United States to be eligible for citizenship. Basically saying we need to increase, so they have to be in the United States at least 5 and 10 years before they become a citizen, because they were afraid they can't just come in and just be a citizen right away. Okay, that's nationalization, becoming a citizen. The Alien Friends Act. The president can order out of the country any aliens he believes dangerous to public peace or suspected treason or conspiracy. So if the president thinks someone is a has a conspiracy going on or anything, that he can just order these people out, and if he thinks that they're treasonous. The Alien Enemies Act authorized the president in time of war, he can imprison or banish aliens subject to the enemy's power. So he can put them in prison, he can banish them in times of war. Onto the Sedition Act, a crime to hinder the enforcement of any law instigating a riot or insurrection. So basically these first three were not so bad. It's okay, it would be good for them to be here citizens 5 to 10 years. And yes, if it's during war, a president needs to be able to take care of banish or imprison aliens that are causing problems, right? And he can order them out of the country. Okay, these seem fine. This is the one that everyone did not like. A crime to hinder the enforcement of any law instigating a riot or insurrection. We'll have to find out what is a riot and what is an insurrection. And so basically looking at this, is it just anybody that gets up and, has a political rally? Or is it anyone that decides to stand up and petition against something? So what is an insurrection, and what is really that? We know what a riot is, but basically this became a problem. The Republicans were stirred up by the Sedition Act, that part of it, because part of the law stated a crime to punish false, scandalous, and malicious statements against the government, the Congress, or president. So basically, if you said anything against the government, said anything against the president, or anything against Congress, you could be prosecuted, right? Or you could be prosecuted. You could be set out of the country with the Sedition Act. So now they started aiming them at Republican newspapers because they were opposite politically. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were opposite in what they believed. And so then if Thomas Jefferson said anything bad about the president, he could be considered a traitor, right? And so this stirred up a lot of deep resentments. 25 Republican newsmen and congressmen were prosecuted. So if you were a newsman and you were doing the news and you said anything against the Federalist, against the government in any way, or thought that you did, you could be prosecuted. And they did so. 10 were actually convicted of doing this, saying something against the government. So people rose up against this Alien and Sedition Acts. These alien thinking, what? This is getting ridiculous. Now we have a government that is actually becoming a despot, the government is controlling and not giving us freedom of speech. James Madison said, and Thomas Jefferson both were against this, but James Madison said, acts based on false premise that the government officials are the masters and not the servants of the people. Basically saying the government is now going to control us. And then Thomas Jefferson said, this violates our First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. We have a guarantee of the freedom of speech and the press, and now they're not letting us have that freedom. So this is where the problem happened by the Sedition Act. The Kentucky and Virginia legislators then. So, of course, Kentucky just became a new state, and Virginia, both of them looked, and basically we'll see James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Basically, Jefferson presented it to Kentucky and Madison to Virginia. So we have Madison with this legislator, and we have Thomas Jefferson with this legislature. So they both were, Kentucky and Virginia legislators were standing up as states against the Alien Sedition Acts. And so James Madison and Thomas Jefferson condemned these acts. Madison presented them to Virginia. Jefferson presented them to Kentucky. And then Kentucky said the Constitution compact made by sovereign states, each state judges what acts violated. So Kentucky declared that Alien and Sedition Acts were void. Basically, the state of Kentucky said, we're not gonna doing that thing. We're not gonna go by that law. And so then Virginia, that state, the resolution was more reserved, but it did also void the acts of the Alien and Sedition Act. But Kentucky and Virginia actually barred the Alien and Sedition Acts. So this started the long struggle between states' rights and the rights of the government, right? The Alien and Sedition Acts, Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were states that were saying, we're not going by whatever all the other states go by. We're not going to go by the government. We're going to have our own states. So this happened with Kentucky and Virginia. Now, the election of 1800, the next election happened, and Thomas Jefferson was a Republican running, and Aaron Burr was going to be his running mate as vice president. And John Adams was running for a second term, the Federalist. Now, he's not very popular with this sedition thing, because a lot of people are thinking, what are they doing? They're getting too much power. But John Adams run, and of course, Charles C. Pinckney, remember that guy that's run for vice president again, is going to run with Adams. Well, what happened? A weird election indeed. John Adams won 65 votes, Pinckney 64 votes, Thomas Jefferson won 73 votes to win the election, but he didn't win because his vice president, Burr, got 73 votes too. So there was a tie. So nowadays we don't run like that. Basically, you run as a party, like a president and vice president run together. Back then they didn't. So we have a tie. So what happens in this tie? So we have Adams and Pinckney, and here's a picture of Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr's of New York and Thomas Jefferson's of Virginia. Burr going to have a whole conspiracy of his own, but we'll talk about that later. He's a pretty evil guy, pretty manipulated guy, and very into himself. Let's just say that. Though the victory was for Thomas Jefferson. Why? How did Thomas Jefferson win? Well, the tie went to the House of Representatives. And there was a Federalist majority in the House. And who was in charge of the House of Representatives but Alexander Hamilton? Alexander Hamilton, of course, he disagreed with Thomas Jefferson politically, but he knew that Thomas Jefferson had integrity. And he knew that Aaron Burr had no integrity. And he did not trust Aaron Burr at all. He had known him since he was like 19 and did not trust him. So he respected, Alexander Hamilton respected Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was surprised, thinking Alexander Hamilton is going to decide for me. And of course, he chose Thomas Jefferson, even though politically they were on different sides on most issues, that Alexander Hamilton chose Thomas Jefferson. And that was a big surprise. But later, Aaron Burr would bring a conspiracy and end up killing Alexander Hamilton. Aaron Burr actually went on as vice president, but he also wanted to be the governor of New York, which he lost because of Alexander Hamilton. And then after killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel, he decided he wanted to withdraw from the whole Union and take over the United States. We'll find out about that. He was definitely had an evil conspiracy going. So President Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States, with Aaron Burr as his vice president. The 12th Amendment had to be. So what was the 12th Amendment? The 12th Amendment was with the Electoral College. But the Electoral College was not working as planned. When you have a tie between a vice president and a president, that's not supposed to happen, right? And you're not supposed to have a vice president and a president being from two different belief parties, right? See, no political parties existed when the Constitution was made, so they never thought about, no provision was made about a president and vice president. They just thought if the first person got the most votes was president, the person who got the next most votes was vice president. But that didn't work. So basically in 1796, there weren't any running, the parties weren't running candidates then, but now we needed to fix this. So the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, remember we had the first 10 amendments, and then the 12th Amendment would be to fix the Electoral College. And so now instead of being the one vote for president would be for one vote for president and vice president together, eliminating the president and vice president from running from different parties. So example was John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were different parties, and one was president and one was vice president, which they always would have conflicts, right? Midnight judges. So John Adams was leaving, but he knew that they needed to have judges, that he needed to put some of these judges and put them as they came into the next, under Thomas Jefferson, pick these judges. So in 1800, the election, the Federalists lost the presidency and majority in Congress, but the Judiciary Act of 1801 1701 was to keep control of the judges, let them be Federalists, not Democrat Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. So he would appoint 16 new federal judges and marshals, clerks, and attorneys for the Supreme Court, for the court system. So the court system would be able to check and balance, and the court system would not be all Republicans. And so he would call these the new circuit courts. And so these outgoing federal judges would happen with Adams, and he'd fill these staunch Federalists. And so we called these the midnight judges. They came in. And they'd finish before the inauguration so they could say, now we just got in, right? The federal legacy. The Federalist Party began to decline in numbers. So although for 15 years they continued to play important roles. So the Federalist, the party of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Adams, they were getting smaller and smaller. And they never regained control of the national government at all, the Federalists. But there are some contributions for the Federalists. First, they were very important in the beginning of our nation to a success of a new nation dedicated to freedom and justice. They were dedicated to freedom and justice, the Federalists were. And they launched the great constitutional republic. Most of the people that signed the Constitution of the United States were Federalists. They set the nation on sound financial basis. Alexander Hamilton set the nation to be financially sound, which was one of the biggest things. Even Thomas Jefferson now and James Madison look to Alexander Hamilton as a genius in doing this. And they established a central government with enough power to hold the Union intact. So now we would have a central government, not just a whole bunch of states that were on their own. We would have a government that could be intact. And it also protect our nation from foreign wars coming in. So that was the legacy of the Federalists. So that is the last Federalist president there would be John Adams. So let's stop there.